Today's guest, Sharon O'Dea, is a co-founder and a workplace consultant and a co-founder of the workplace consultancy firm Lithos Partners and the digital workplace experience study. Sharon, you focus on the future of work and workplace experience and everything that's tied to that. I think you helped multiple small and big businesses as well as government organizations move their work to the digital workplace.
That's correct.
And today we will be talking about the workplace and how the reality changed in the past years. My name is Luca Birsa and I'm the co-founder of Joan, and I will be hosting Sharon today on our Future of Work podcast. Sharon, again, happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
This intro sometimes can be a bit, let's say, robotic. So would you correct me or add anything here?
About who I am. So yeah, I'm Sharon. I'm one of the founders, as you say, of Lithos Partners. And we're a little boutique consultancy that help organizations make sense of what they need to make a successful digital workplace. Platforms, processes, governance, strategy, all of that. I'm just a big digital workplace nerd. I've been in the space about 20 years. Yeah, we work particularly with a lot of large and thorny organizations. So whether they're big or regulated, where it's sometimes difficult to get the stuff right. I really like I like it when it's difficult to make the stuff work. So that's what makes it interesting.
You said that you work in the space of the workplace transformation, right? And you consult on companies that want to change how they work, I guess. This is everything's very theoretical right now. Yeah. So what does that mean? What do you do? How does your work start? Where does it end? What do you do for these companies?
So our work kind of covers off three broad areas, I suppose. We could say they tend to be around either discovery, which is organizations understand that they have a productivity challenge and engagement challenge, but they don't really know why or what they need to do about it. So often a lot of the work that we'll be doing is in that discovery area, which is identifying what are the barriers to getting things done now. Sometimes it's down to the tools. Often it's how you're using the tools, or that there is something missing from your tool mix. But also it might be challenges of training or the way that you've configured the platform. So really that discovery is about really getting under the skin of an organization, understanding what's missing or what's not working well, and then making recommendations for whether they need to hire people, buy in some new technologies, change what they're currently doing, bring in more processes and governance around what we do. And there's two further stages, I guess, which is developing, which is really to do a lot of kind of solution design. What tools do you need? It's usually more than one, but also what are the things that you need around those to make sense of it? That's often around needing to hire a team or bring in a better life cycling or governance or strategy around it. And then finally, the last part is delivery. So often we'll have a digital workplace program, and we've got to support organizations with things like configuration, with training, with adoption, to make sure that those deliver value. So really, those are the three areas of work that we broadly do. Often, I think I really like the discovery bit the most. Sometimes we get involved with all three. Sometimes it's just, one or more of those.
So when you talk about discovery, again, if you're really, really direct, so that means you talk to the people, you figure out what are they doing, and kind of you're like a doctor that goes in and kind of figure out what's missing in the system.
Yeah. So you always use a range of approaches. So we have our own a survey tool that we use, a benchmarking tool that we built called the Digital Workplace Experience Study. And that goes to a sample of employees to get their perceptions of how this stuff is working for them. But you can't use surveys on their own. You also need to go out and talk to your key stakeholders about what's working for them and what isn't, and talk to your end users about what's working. Where they experience barriers. There's a mental model that I love to use. When I was at university, I didn't do that much work, but I did watch a lot of really bad TV. So I used to watch a lot of crime dramas of various sorts. And in those, they always use this kind of model of when they're trying to convict someone of a crime, say, in court. They're looking at three things. Did the guy do the murder? It will be means, motive, and opportunity. So actually, when we go and talk to people, and talk to organizations, often what we find is adoption programs will focus lots on the means. Do people have the ability to access this platform, this tool? But there's two parts of that picture that are missing then. There's opportunity and motive, which is, does someone have time in their day to do this? Does it fit in with how they currently work? And then the other one that is really important is motive. Do they have a good reason to do it compared with all the other things they have on in their day? So to give you an example of that, we worked a while ago with an organisation where everyone, or most of the people who work for them, are out on the road physically in cars. So recognizing that they weren't at their desk, they'd given them tablet devices, not iPads, like a cheaper version. But to save money, they'd not given them one per person, they had one per car. So they had this like quite annoying two-factor authenticator, which just meant it took quite a long time to get on. So technically speaking, people had means, but it was kind of complicated. And then there were a couple of other factors, which were no one had really considered that in the UK where they were based, you can't legally use a tablet device when you're in charge of a vehicle. So it was useless to them in that situation. So the only time they could use it is when they've pulled up in the car park. But when you've got as far as the car park, you come up with the barrier of motivation, which is, by that point, you want to go inside and have a cup of tea or go to the bathroom. And those things are more important to you than logging on to your intranet to look at the news or do whatever it is that you need to do. So if we want to make these tools work, we have to really think about those three things: the means, the motive, the opportunity. And I'm ensure that the tools that we design and deliver for employees actually fit in with the real ways that people work and the things that they're doing in their day. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I think like I'm really trying to kind of to put this into the context of what happened in the past years,
Yeah.
I mean, we probably had the best motive in the world, right, to get this working to the point where it's kind of, it was this or it was the end of working as we know it. I mean, the COVID really, really shook up things, right? So people had this really intense motive to get started, right? And I remember before, at Joan, we tried to play with this kind of technology a lot, and we tried like desk booking, we tried pitching that to companies. It never worked, right? No motive, right? Now I kind of get it why it didn't work, right? But now we're past that, right? Where would you say we are right now in terms of what's going on in the market or how companies are perceiving this?
It's a really interesting time, isn't it? So like you say, COVID was like adoption just it was like a slalom. Suddenly, everyone realized that they had to have a digital workplace. They had to have an ecosystem of digital tools or they wouldn't get anything done. But what we found actually is that while necessity is the mother of invention, or a line that I really overuse is utility is the number one driver of adoption. As soon as something is useful, people will use it. And during COVID, that happened on steroids, right? But what we found is that a lot of tools were adopted without any of the normal things you would do around adoption and change. So the way normally when you're planning a change, you can tell people about it, you plan the change, you communicate the change, you tell people about it, and then you make the change. What happened during COVID is we made the change and we had to tell people about it afterwards. And it kind of means that we haven't developed a lot of the processes and behaviors, and we need to make the most of the tools that we have. So, for example, lots of organizations already had Teams somewhere, but no one really used it. And all of a sudden, everyone's using it, but they're using it in like lots of different ways. So you'll find that files are stored all over the place, or, that we're not it means that we're doing things like just replicating our office-based behaviors on digital tools rather than finding maybe more effective and efficient ways to work in a more distributed way. So actually what I'm finding now is almost like in the past, a lot of the programs we do, well, like we've got to buy a platform, we've got to buy something that does everything for everyone. And what we're actually finding is people are now kind of starting to unpick some of the behaviors they had during COVID and actually start to think, how can we be more strategic about this? So, for example, digital tools don't exist on their own, and recognizing that we also need moments of connection. So, how do we make sure that if we're in the office, we're making the most of that time? You don't go into an office and just spend the whole day on Zoom calls. So, we need to make sure that if our teams are in, how are they all in? How are we making the most of this time together? Because oddly, all that moment of separation made us much better at digital dexterity, but it also made us understand that we miss people. We kind of need people sometimes. And actually, organizations are now very slowly starting to think, okay, we need to agree good digital ways of working, good distributed ways of working, but also how that interacts with the physical workplace and how we work together as teams as well. So at the moment, I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying we went all in on digital tools. And actually, I think now we're working out that it's not just about the tools, it's also about the behaviors. And we're having to relearn how we use them and put a lot more structure around all of that so that we're really getting the value from them that we need.
I kind of view it, from a perspective of making it stick. It's not like, because if you're using it out of a necessity, because like there's, obviously you're going to use it, right?
Yeah.
And then like you said, as people are now moving back to kind of the normal, I mean, everything's normal now. A lot of these tools, I mean, they're probably not that important. I mean, you can migrate to the old, and especially because the old also included a lot of this, let's say, culture, and which is culture building / connection. And we see that like in our office, right? It's people, like you said, people come here to bond, to connect. And it doesn't make sense to have like an office where people, all they do is kind of do just Zoom calls.
Exactly.
And on the other side, like you probably also have like an opinion on what like Musk or similar leaders did, like saying, guys, you need to come into the office, you need to be here physically present all the time. So how do you kind of reconcile these two trends or these two things, and how does this tie together? Who's right here?
Unsurprisingly, for anyone who knows me, I'm very much not in the Musk camp on this one. It's when I worked in banking, there was a real thing about being in the office, I'd get into the City of London at 7:00 in the morning to spend the whole day on phone calls with colleagues who were in Singapore. It really made no difference if I was in the office at all or not. But people who thrived in that environment kind of over-index their own experience and think, well, I got by in this. It's obviously important. Actually, there is a new generation of leadership who recognise that's nonsense. What is it? Toddlers and dolphins haven't quite developed the idea of object permanence. They forget that things that they can't see exist. And a lot of middle management are also like that. As soon as they can't see you, they forget that you're there. So I think there is a little bit of like the pendulum swinging the other way, that people who want to get ahead with that style of management are starting to come in just so that they can be seen. But I don't think they're necessarily adding value. And I'm very much of the view that actually that way of working will slowly die out. But working practices are quite sticky and slow to change. And leaders who did succeed in that kind of environment have a tendency to over-index their own value.
So what I'm kind of getting here, it's not so much about technology, but it has everything to do with, how the company operates, how people operate, like these, let's say, values that they have, the culture that they have, the interactions that they have. And the technology is there just kind of to support, to facilitate.
Exactly that. So I have the other saying that I roll out quite a lot when I'm working with clients is, technology is easy, but people are hard. And I don't know, for example, this week, Meta, what was Facebook, have announced that they're closing their workplace product. And what I found really interesting about that is, one of their ambitions at the beginning was to fundamentally change the way that we work. And I think it was interestingly naive of them to think that other organizations could suddenly start working like Facebook. Actually, working culture is surprisingly hard to change. Email and the ways that we work are really inefficient, but somehow they never go away. So another example would be Atos, the technology consulting firm in France. They announced in 2012 that they were going to ban internal email. And they went on, like, right from the CEO down, was in like, we're going to do more kind of social, collaborative, asynchronous ways of working. And what was really interesting is, despite that level of support right from the top and bringing in the tools and making all this work, something like 8 years on, they'd reduced it by 50%. I'm like, that's a lot of progress. But they wouldn't, actually, it's never going to go away. Or maybe it will eventually, but actually our ways of working are incredibly slow to adapt, because we have to work the way that everyone else works. It's almost like a hive. We have to change at the same time, and that's really hard. So to the point that you were just making then, technology, I shouldn't say this as a technology consultant, but I am, kind of doesn't matter. People will use tools they have, and they'll find weird ways of making them work for them. Actually, it's behaviors and people that matter. And we have to think about both of those things in concert. To get the most value from your technology, you also have to think about the people who use that technology. And you can't just turn something on and hope that it will make all the difference without thinking about some of those cultural and change factors around it.
Sharon, if we kind of just talk about the shortcuts, perhaps there is a shortcut that you kind of use, or a trick that you use to kind of facilitate. Surely, I mean, changing culture is hard, but like, you see, you talk to the stakeholders in company, you figure out, hey guys, perhaps you shouldn't be sending emails, or you shouldn't be doing meetings for 10 people. What about, doing a Slack hangout, something like that, let's say. Would this be something like a type of a suggestion that you would do?
Exactly that sort of thing. I think, so honestly, some of the vendors haven't helped in the past by selling their tools as this is going to transform the way you work. It won't on its own. You have to transform the way you work, and the tools are part of that process. It's not a magic bullet. It never is. But actually, so going back to the point I think I made earlier about discovery, time spent on reconnaissance is never time ill spent. Actually, if we really understand our problems and understand the ways that our people work and the context in which they're working, and we design around that, we're much more likely to achieve that kind of transformation that we're looking for. A lot of time you come along and, organizations will select, a new intranet platform and just expect it to change their organization unless you've worked out how it's going to fit and what value it's going to make. Then you're not going to do that. To be transformational, we need to fully understand the problem. So it always starts with discovery as far as I'm concerned. So that would be my shortcut.
So basically really thinking about what's going on and really think about why are you trying to change this? Because sometimes, there's a fad and like people are, just use that tool and everything's going to be better. Just use that tool. And sometimes it's really about thinking, why do you want to change how you work? Like perhaps it's your business realities are defining the tools, defining the ways you operate, and perhaps you just need to think about how you make the most of a bad situation in a sense, if it's if the environment is forcing you towards something, right?
Well, also change is that this obviously COVID sped all of this up, but we're working against a background of quite significant change in the way that we work. And yes, some of that was about kind of the for example, the massive switch to home working that happened during COVID. But that was a continuation of a trend that's been happening for many, many years. Organizations have been moving to those distributed ways of working for lots of other reasons. But there's loads of other changes still happening. So technological change, the ways in which we as humans are going to have to work increasingly augmented by or supported by AI is a massive change for a lot of people. And that's coming down the road really, really fast. But there's all sorts of other change as well around our operating models. So increasingly, many of us are working on short-term contracts, or maybe for more than one employer, or maybe we work for a third-party supplier. So actually, it's not just about where you work or when you work, but also kind of who are you in relation to the organization and in relation to the technologies you use. So while we're talking about dealing with that kind of change, we have to recognize not just the change that's happening now, but the change that's coming down the road. So actually that phrase, skate to where the puck is, a lot of the time when you bring technology in, by the time you've launched it, it's already out of date. We actually have to start thinking about our capacity for change as well. How can these things become adaptable to a world in which our work is changing really fast, just in the context of society is changing really fast? How do technologies support us against the background of climate change, for example? If more of us are, experiencing extreme weather, technology is part of how we become more resilient. So we need to think about all of that as well.
I mean, it's like, I talking from my own experience, I don't like to be in my shoes when it comes to these changes. I mean, I like to be in my shoes from a perspective of learning something new, but I can also see that how this is very, very hard, right? Like you said.
Exactly.
Sustainability, climate change, AI. I mean, everything's changing, right?
And the world of work is changing as fast as the world around us is changing. If you look at, my mother did the same job for 40 years. Lots of our parents and grandparents, they worked for somewhere for 10 years, for 20 years, for longer. Everyone I know, they're in a job for 2 years at the most, and many of us are doing two things. So actually, the expectation that we'll just know our way around our workplace technology just isn't true anymore. You're in and out. We haven't got time to learn complicated systems because we're not there long enough to find it out.
And plus, right now we're working at this backdrop of distributed work, right?
Yeah.
That COVID didn't just force us to use certain tools; it also forced us to work remotely.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of companies, this was the first contact with this remote distributed work. And then we kind of seen like this total hype, everybody's gonna work remotely, and then we've seen this total backlash. No, you need to come to work. Everybody's slacking off. So, what really happened to the workplace, Sharon? What would you say? Where are we in terms of what's the reality today for the companies, the ones that you're talking to?
Well, so I find this quite interesting. This whole kind of like hybrid work, remote work is new. For large organizations, it absolutely isn't. If you work for a global bank or multinational, you've been working in distributed ways for at least a decade. It's just become a lot easier to do that. The challenge is actually much more around smaller organizations have had to adapt to the same way. So the idea that this is new or going away is absurd as far as I'm concerned. But also I find this really exciting in a world where, we want to tap into global talent markets, but we also want to, actually remote work, distributed work enables us to tackle so many of the challenges that we're facing in the future. For example, more of us are going to have to work until we're well into our 70s. Actually, distributed work is a way that we can help people to do that because, people don't want to be commuting. We want to employ multi-generational workforces. We want to tap into talent across the globe. And these new ways of working are actually ways that enable that. Similarly, I'm quite excited about the potential of these new ways of working to create a much more inclusive workplace, where enabling people to participate in ways that are much more suited to their work style, to their personality. So actually, these are, to me, that kind of swinging of the pendulum the other way has been a little bit surprising, and it feels somewhat to me like potentially a missed opportunity for organizations because none of this is particularly new, and big organizations have been embracing this for at least 10 years, if not longer.
But again, like you said, like big organizations have been embracing this for a while now. You also said like the small organizations, they really need to adapt and face the new realities because this is new for them. But we need to be honest, right, Sharon? It's the distributed work. It's not especially simple, right? Especially if you're used to this kind of seeing people work, having them present. How do you cope with that? How do you even get started? If you're somebody that really wants to jump on this train and kind of access this pool of talent and the productivity
for me, it's about
gains.
So going back to what I said about discovery, it was actually about being much more intentional about it, isn't it? That you don't turn the technology on and it suddenly will make the change. Actually, we need to agree what we're doing. So, for example, as a team, how do we collaborate with each other? When do we send an email versus having a Teams chat? When do we, under what circumstances should we do a meeting? And are people aware of the tools they have?
And when do we write something down, right? This is probably the number one thing that we need to figure out. This is the biggest learning curve for me. It was, I suck at communicating, right? At written communication. And I need to write more things down. If you have people around you in the office, it's fairly easy to address that. You can walk to somebody to explain it. But what if you have somebody junior starting off? How do they even get started? And now...
Exactly. And this is hard, right? Because it's quite counterintuitive for lots of us. So, one of the arguments against remote working, and I absolutely understand it, is we don't get that kind of knowledge transfer. So I know in the early stages of my career, you'd hear someone on the phone and basically just copy the way they did stuff, right? Because you're like, that's how I've learned how to do things like client handling. You listen to people who are good at it and kind of copy them and learn from them. In a world where we're all distributed, you can't overhear what someone's doing. And it's those kind of, I think the whole idea of maybe water cooler moments is a little bit over exaggerated. They don't happen that often, but there is that kind of ambient awareness, ambient knowledge of learning from others. And that does become difficult in a distributed context. So that does rely on those who are more senior to, as you say, write stuff down. And we're not very good at it because it requires taking time out.
You really need to be intentional, right? You can't rely on, oh, the knowledge transfer will just happen. No worries. Just sit down next to the good sales guy and like you learn the ropes, right?
Exactly. So that, there's famously in call centers, you'll have someone who is like the best salesperson, but the next best salespeople are the people who sit next to them. And we don't have that in a digital environment unless we intentionally create it. So we actually need to think about, those of us, well, it's a similar thing about kind of knowledge management. If you have to make an effort at it, it basically doesn't happen, which becomes a real challenge, that we're not very good at filing things or keeping things as organizations. That it requires a degree of process and intentionality. And that is quite a tough nut to crack. So what I'm seeing work quite well in organizations is to come up with things like playbooks. For this kind of meeting, do it this way. For that kind of, if we're trying to come up with new ideas, here's some ways that we can do that, to give people tools. But actually, it means that there's a lot more onus on a manager to not just be someone who supervises, but actually is more of a facilitator for their team. And I think that kind of requires us as leaders to step back and actually think and change the way that we do things. And all of that is hard, and organizations don't invest in it.
Yeah, I guess instead of overseeing how people work, is talking to them and figuring out what do they need for them to be successful, right?
Yeah, and I think it really places a whole load of new demands on managers. Some of it around facilitating teamwork, but also there's much more of a kind of pastoral care angle. Are you okay? We don't ask people that enough. So yes, there is always this worry of like, oh, are people slacking off? But the opposite of that seems to be what's occurring. We've got so many things going on that people are burnt out. Something like 70% of employees, even though they like their job, are reporting feeling overwhelmed by notifications and things they have to manage and not feeling supported. And that's a real challenge. So, as leaders, are we checking in on people? And digital ways of working kind of make that hard sometimes. And I think there's a final thing, which is in the Gallup employee engagement survey, one of the questions is, do you have a best friend at work? Which I think is really interesting. Like, do you have a mate, someone that you check in on? And actually, people who have a best friend at work are much less likely to leave because they feel a sense of affinity. When you're in a fully distributed organization, you haven't made friends at work, right? So actually, it becomes, work is much less sticky because you don't have the same relationships with people. So actually, how do we enable people to become not necessarily best mates, but, to have a sense of friendship or camaraderie with their colleagues, which is sometimes hard in a digital context.
You started so many good things in this answer right now. I really want to come back to first one was you mentioned how do we know how much people are working, and this kind of unclogging them and whatnot. That's kind of one topic, and the other one was kind of this building relationships. So I'd like to kind of start with the first. And
sure thing.
I mean, we talk about is kind of these good aspects of culture, good aspects of technology, right? Everything's positive. This kind of vogue concepts of, are you feeling fine? How can I help you? And sometimes, for somebody looking from afar, this could feel very, very much like, oh, come on, do the work. Stop complicating. What's your thought on that?
This touches on a really interesting point, and I think important and valuable point. That when we're talking about all this, in your head, you've got these kind of really kind of cutting edge organizations like consulting, and they've got those TikTok videos of how everyone's having a great day at work. And actually, for most people, work is kind of sucky. A lot of people work in hourly paid jobs with terrible managers who don't care about them. And the reality for work is it's not that glamorous for a lot of people, and and they don't have particularly good conditions. And there isn't, when we have an absence of trust, and there is this ability that then the digital layer in that just becomes a whole kind of level of management and risk for organizations that we don't really look at. So we've some organizations have taken it so far the opposite way that it's just about spying on employees where they don't trust each other, and I find that quite worrying.
What's the worst war story that you can share without names? Like, what's kind of the worst case that you've seen of this?
So, okay, there's one organization that I know of, And like a lot of organizations got bought out by private equity, who then wanted to like rinse the asset as much as possible. This might be a familiar story for some people. And what they did is basically replace anyone who left with remote employees in markets with lower employment standards in Asia and whatever. And then it basically put spyware on everyone's computers that took tracked all their keystrokes and took screenshots and a picture of them every few minutes. And if people couldn't justify the thing that was on their screen, or if they couldn't see them in the picture, they wouldn't pay them for that time. And I mean, on the one hand, that's kind of this weird digital panopticon. On the other, I was reading about similar on the BBC News recently. This is on the rise. For, if you're on a minimum wage doing some sort of data entry job or similar, that's not unusual. And I think we do need to have a conversation about the degree to which that's kind of acceptable, or what we can do to create some sort of safeguards around that. Because what we do risk is, while we're focusing on how we can empower people with digital work, we're actually can be also making it worse for people. And we don't want that.
I mean, but don't you feel that, in a sense, the realities will catch up with this type of company? Because I'm 100% certain that like tracking people every second does not increase productivity.
Absolutely
You can
not.
do so many things to fake your interactivity, your work and whatnot, if you're not motivated. So, and the motivation can come from multiple angles, right? It can be like you really enjoy what you work on. You're in a good environment. You have good connections with the people around you. You work on interesting things, and I think even more important thing is that we need to start talking about results, right? No company doesn't exist just like a charity organization giving people work so that they do something meaningful in their life, right? It's all about revenues in the end, the financial bottom line, and I guess focusing on what do you do versus how many hours you spend is probably the correct approach. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, when as someone who sells services to organizations, someone always tells me it's not how much time it takes you, it's how much value it produces for them. So when, selling my own services, it's we can focus on the outcome rather than the time spent to do it. But when you're in a paid job, we kind of use hours as a proxy of productivity, which is always going to be a little bit of a drawback. We historically, you would label someone as a poor performing employee if they regularly turned up late. Almost it wouldn't matter if they got the job done or not. And actually we do need to change that mindset a bit. Again, it goes back to the management behaviors. That ultimately, if someone is doing their job and producing what you need them to do, it shouldn't matter how long it takes them. But in reality, it often does, because we haven't got any other measures, or we're not very good at measuring outcomes.
I think it all really comes down to the management, I guess, to the owners, to the top level. How do they view what are the outcomes that companies need to achieve, and how they measure those, and how that goes down the chain.
It's a really interesting one, because if you go in any big organization, they'll have all manner of different performance management systems with people with OKRs and listing how what they do somehow ties up to the golden thread of the company outcomes. But I think most of us know it kind of, a lot of it is absolute BS, isn't it? You somehow got a lot of people's jobs basically just involve producing some PowerPoint and sending it to someone else. So it's quite hard to say the degree to which that actually results in tangible outcomes. There is a real challenge there about what we measure and how we prove value of what we do. And I can't say that many organizations have cracked it. I'm not sure that I have even.
I mean, in a sense, all of this technology, like we're talking about Teams, we're talking about Google Docs, like on the online wikis, like all of this workplace tooling that exists, right? All of this tooling exists because it sells you kind of the story, like more productivity, better work, and all we're talking today about is like kind of totally non-technical things that like impact the way we work and the outcomes that we do way more. How do you kind of reconcile those two? I mean, you're you're a consultant that helps people like with the technology, and then like you're more of a shrink for their business.
Actually, I've never been called that before, but thank you. No, that's not to say that technology can't help with that. If we want to change, technology doesn't change culture by itself. It reflects and slowly changes our culture. So we can be using those to more effectively do all those things I talked about. If we're able to share what we're doing, then we can move to more outcomes-based ways of measuring. If we want people, we're recognizing that, for example, remote and hybrid working is not going away. Actually, we need to use those tools to make that work effectively. So it's about enabling those behaviors rather than the technology on its own. So it is about agreeing, what do we have, what do we need to have, and how are we going to use it? So technology is absolutely part of that picture.
And now this kind of gives me a really good segue to talk about the second part of that, like interesting answer that you gave, and it's this, contact, right? Connection.
Yeah.
And how much do you feel that as new generations enter the workforce, like Gen Z, Gen Y, I don't know, Gen Ch, whatever, how does that change their ability to build connections, not only in kind of real world but also in digital world, right? We have all of these AR, VR trends that are popping up, TikTok generations, people spending all of their time on their phones. Do you feel that that's kind of going to shape the way that we're able to build these connections, and that this kind of gives us more room, more ability to build this in a distributed way? So in a sense, as we're growing up with technology, it actually helps us build these distributed workplaces?
I think so, because we now have 2, 3 generations of digital natives in the workplace. For most people, this is just stuff that we've always used, right? I've been online since I was 13, and I'm relatively old. So now the generations beyond us, this is just how you get stuff done, and those tools will always have to adapt to new behaviors. We know that the way that people communicate is now moving from being much more from written down to much more visual. How do we capture that? How do we share that? So absolutely, but we need to create that, again, going back to what I said earlier about intentionality. So it's been quite interesting in the digital workplace space that about 10 years ago, when Facebook was still kind of on the ascendant, there was a whole swathe like, we're going to move to enterprise social, user-generated content in the workplace. And everyone went really, really big on it. And we've almost come slightly the opposite way now, where people are like, too much content, too much going on, and people not able to cut through the noise. So the real thing I'm seeing in that space now is actually helping people with relevance. What do I actually need? And using data to give people the things that are important to them, the content, the services. So we're moving away from kind of the mass of content to much more curated experiences of what we offer people at work, because people have just so much that they're trying to, that we read and see all day long, that we've got to help people kind of sort out what's important. But then similarly to that, thinking about communities, how do we enable people to find others, to connect with others, whether that's for support, connections of identity, of affinity, or whatever that might be. So for every organization, we need to find the right kind of mix of how do our people communicate, how do they want to communicate, and what connections do we need to make. And actually communication is part of that connection, because it helps us to build weak ties, as they call it in sociology.
Is there kind of a trick or something that you like, you're an experienced consultant, like there's like a trick that you do that to help facilitate this connection building in a distributed workplace? Like you with every client, like there's a bunch of things that you suggest, but like you always say, start with this if you want to build this kind of relationships. What's that?
Well,
what's that small trick that you have up your sleeve?
For me, it's probably about relevance, I guess. So, if we want people to understand the organization, we've got to help them with, use data really smartly to connect people to the things that are important to them, the people that are important to them. Actually, in workplaces, we've got absolutely loads of data on our people, who they are, where they work. We don't have to use that in a creepy way, but actually to connect people to others who are doing similar things. That actually we can be really smart on how we do that. And we're not, a lot of the time, we waste that.
Okay, Sharon. So, with all of these trends that we're seeing, right? the technology stuff that's going on in the workplace, the fact that we're kind of, we're thinking about how we use the technology that to facilitate all these connections, right? And I guess there's lots of bright minds like you are really thinking of what we could do to kind of to build really good distributed um, workplaces. What would you say it's like the number one thing that you focus on today? Like, what do you see as an emerging trend or as an important trend in the workplace, in the tooling that we use day in, day out in this kind of modern companies?
I guess the thing at the moment is about helping it make sense and feel coherent. So I was reading a stat the other day that actually the number of tools that any employee is expected to use has doubled since 2019. You're like, so every day you're switching from this to that, and all of that has a cognitive cost, right? You have to, every time you have a notification come through on Slack, you're like, what was I doing before? And we're constantly kind of switching. And then on top of that, we have to read all these things that are coming as, there's just, it's a lot for people to get their heads around. And I was at HR technology conference the other week, and everyone, there were so many different platforms just doing individual little tasks. It's like, actually, people have to go all over the place to, say you're having some visitors come in, you have to like book it in the calendar, go to another system to tell security, maybe book some, we're constantly switching. And it's just too much for people, and each of those systems has its own design language, its own labeling, its own. So actually what we're increasingly seeing is organizations who want to just, because in a world where we're all working distributedly, that's not even a word, and we're working in distributed ways, actually our primary employee experience is the digital employee experience, and sometimes that experience is a bit rubbish. So actually what can we do to elevate it overall? And one thing we can do is cut out a lot of the mess, the joins, whether that's through integrating tools in much more seamless ways with maybe an intranet or a digital workplace as a presentation layer, to kind of hide a lot of the joins so people aren't doing that sort of switching. If I get a notification through in one system, I should be able to act on it there without having to go all over the place. So what we're seeing is this kind of trend towards a more holistic, more integrated experience that you're buying best-in-class SaaS tools from all over the place to do things really, really well, but making them look somewhat more seamless for the end user. Because as employees, we often don't know where one tool finishes and the other begins. We just want to get stuff done at work.
Nor we should focus on that and kind of be like the tool specialist. It's kind of, we should be the job specialist, right?
Exactly. Sometimes they'll be like, you've got to go to Badger to do that, and then some other system that you don't understand to do that one. And it's like, the end user doesn't know, and there's a lot to remember. So actually, how can we cut that complexity out and actually think about, it's especially true in organizations where, often they'll say to their customers, oh, we're a digital first organization. They'll talk about how great they are at digital. And then when you see what employees have to use, they're like, oh, that's really bad. So if you want people to kind of believe in your brand promise, it has to be reflected internally as well. And there's often a gap between the quality of the things that we give our external customers and those that we give our internal ones. And that starts to become a bit of a chasm when we're used to high quality technology in our personal lives.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Sharon. I think this is what we are seeing as well. I mean, as we're talking to companies, we see this really strong need to or push toward consolidation of tools, right? Instead of having 10 different systems, like having one, and really focusing on the user experience.
Exactly.
I mean, we've always tried to build things that are as simple as possible, but I mean, as we get more and more solutions in place in companies, like millions of SaaS solutions for every job,
every little thing,
it's
the
even
analogy
more
I always use
ever.
is when a swan is swimming, you see them like on the water, looking really graceful, sliding across water. If you look under the water, they're paddling like furiously. And actually, what we need to do is have it. We know that under the skin, there's that paddling there, or under the surface of the water. But what the end user needs to see is the graceful sliding of the swan. They don't need to know that it's 15 different systems under the hood, because that just creates a level of this is adding to that feeling of being overwhelmed, which is leading to that sense of burnout. So what can we do to make it tidier?
And do you think that in the end, like kind of investing in this kind of technology, it really helps with the, let's say, the bottom line, the productivity?
Absolutely. when we've got a war for talent, I know it sounds like a little thing, but actually each of those little irritations adds up over the course of the day. Like, people want to just go into work and be able to do their job without all
Do
this
you
stuff
have
getting in
a
the way.
success story like that kind of showcases that in the most plastic way? What would be that?
So actually, one organisation that we worked for, it was a children's charity in the UK, and again started with discovery, and went and spoke to some of them are working hands-on with families who are working with very troubled families who, and they really, the last thing they want to be doing is logging on and doing something on their computer. It's they want to be helping that family over there, or we had people where, and actually the problem they had was friction, and I remember one particular quote that we had was, I only ever look at anything from the organisation when I go to the toilet. Like, they had 2 minutes, like while they're, maybe going to the bathroom. And we were like, okay, so how can we make this work for them in that window that they have? Because at every other time, there is something more important for them to be doing. So actually, some of it was, so in that particular, and then, you can absolutely understand that. They're really pressed for time, and they could be genuinely a life or death situation. So what we ended up doing for them was actually, how can we remove as much friction as possible from this entire exchange? So what we ended up doing was putting their entire intranet on the web, so it has no password. So they can just, that already takes out all of the friction in visiting it, and then made sure that all the content was rewritten so that it could be understood in under a minute. To make everything as uncomplex as it possibly could be, and then started to integrate tools into it so that they can then access what they need to with the appropriate levels of security below that. But actually, in that case, we saw their engagement levels shoot right up, because it was about making the tool work for the people in the way that they work, not the other way around.
And I'm guessing that then engagement also followed, and happiness with that. And
and that's when you start to see improvements in retention, in people feeling like reporting levels of stress and so on. So, it's a challenge that lots of organizations have, that when the technology shouldn't get in the way of you doing the job, it should do the opposite of that. It should be an enabler. But for so many organizations, it's not. It actually becomes a series of small irritants that you have to, or hurdles that you get past the whole day long. So actually, what we need to do is almost, how can we make it, what's it that, I think there's a phrase that the best technology is indistinguishable from magic. It should almost become invisible, that you don't have to think about it.
Okay. Would you say kind of that's the number one thing that rubs you the wrong way, is when kind of companies take the technology and think that now everything's going to be good? Or what's kind of like the one thing that you would really ask everybody in the world that they stop doing today, so we get a better world for everybody working in these companies?
Oh, that's a really good question. What should people stop doing? Honestly, emailing. But I think there's two things that will survive a nuclear holocaust. It's cockroaches and email. Somehow it will never go away, but it should. It's a really, it adds to our levels of stress. But actually, to take that a full circle though, what can we do to work more effectively in more intentional ways? And that is actually about stepping back and going, could we do this a better way? Maybe with the tools that we have, or using different tools.
I think it's, in the end, a lot of times it's a good question of what you said in the beginning, like really thinking about what you do and doing this discovery, and really thinking, what do I need to fix? What's the motivation for fixing it? And
we don't have to boil the ocean on that one. As a manager or a leader, we can do that with our own team. Why don't we sit down and spend half a day actually going, right, how are we going to get stuff done? And actually agreeing. You could look at, what some best practices are, or you could just work it out between yourselves. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. We've got all these different tools. We just need to agree to use them in common ways so that we are actually collaborating and not just sending stuff. So maybe the first thing is to actually sit down and write, how can we as a group of people work more effectively? And that would be a start, right?
We're slowly coming to the end, so I think this is a good segue into a closing thought that you really want the listeners to keep in their head after they're done with this podcast. So what would you say would be your number one advice to somebody that really wants to improve how they work in these modern times, what would that be?
Probably just to get a sense of what's not working now. And the best way to do that is actually just go and ask people. Go and see how other people in your organization actually work. So I've seen this done in one organization by one Friday a month. They called it Fix It Friday. And the digital team would be set the task of either going and fixing a process, something that didn't work currently, or going and spending a day on the front line to find out how their stuff is actually working. Because often we'll create stuff centrally and we'll send it to other parts of the business and it just something doesn't quite click. So actually what we need to do is get a real sense of what do people actually do and what are the problems that they're having. And often they're the best people to solve this. Often when we do big technology programs, at the beginning we'll be asked to supply a whole load of use cases that we're going to measure against. And they're never the ones that create the biggest value. The ones that do are the ones that we didn't even know about at the beginning, because there's always an appropriation process of technology, which is, we look at it, we kind of get what it does, we start to use it, and then we start to apply it to the problems we actually have. That there's a thing that we're struggling with and whatever. And actually what you find is then people start to adapt and use tools in really interesting ways that apply to a very specific context. So actually, sorry, I've given two answers here. The first one then is to go and find out how things work. But the second is to give people space to experiment and work stuff out. So actually, one of the problems that we have a lot of the time is we're too busy just constantly delivering. And actually, sometimes you just want to be able to mess around with stuff and see how can I make this work. So we need to give people space, both time in their diary, but also psychological safety to go and work out how they can make stuff work for them. AI could be really interesting, and I think we're barely scratched the surface on it, but we need to give people the ability to work out how they can make it work for them, and that means letting them experiment and play with it a little bit.
In giving them this space, right? I think this is a great closing thought, because what you're saying is that instead of focusing on the next shiny technological thing, let's focus on our people. And let's not postpone stuff, and let's not wait, and let's just talk to them and ask them what should we fix, and let them fix it, right?
Yeah.
With the tools that you probably already have those tools in the company today.
Exactly. Just allow people to try, and they'll work things out.
Yeah, I love that closing thought. Sharon, you've been great on this talk today. I really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me on. It was a really good chat. I love nerding out on this stuff, so it's great.
Yeah, good. And I really like the fact that we didn't go into too much details in terms of, sometimes all of this stuff can feel very BS, digital transformation, blah, blah. And it really doesn't need to be, it's mostly just sitting down with your team and kind of just talking it out, figuring out, hey, what should we do? How can we fix it? What's wrong? What's missing? And instead of finding a huge vendor, what are you gonna do for us? Talk to your people.
Talk to your people, find out what's broken, fix it.
Yeah, love it. I really, really, really enjoyed all of this. So,
me too.
Thanks.